In this episode, we delve into the Ethiopian Civil War, 1974 to 1991, empire, ideology, and the Red Terror. Please subscribe, like, and share. We talk about wars in the hope that men may learn to honorably avoid it. Foundations before the war. Ethiopia before 1974. Pre-colonial and imperial roots. A state forged by myth, conquest, and hierarchy. Long before Ethiopia became a Cold War battleground, it existed as one of the world's oldest continuous political entities, its legitimacy anchored as much in myth as in military force. In 1270, the restoration of the Solomonic dynasty under Emperor Yakuno Amlak re-established a royal lineage that claimed direct descent from King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopian tradition as Makeda. This lineage was not merely ceremonial. It functioned as a divine mandate for rule, placing the emperor above contestation and rendering political dissent sacrilegious. By the late 19th century, this sacred kingship intersected with modern empire building under Emperor Menelik II, who ruled from 1889 to 1913. Menelik's reign marked the territorial consolidation of what is now modern Ethiopia. Through military campaigns backed by firearms acquired from European powers, Menelik expanded the empire southward, eastward, and westward. Entire societies were forcibly incorporated. The Oromo, the largest ethnic group in the region, were brought under imperial rule after decisive defeats at Anoli, 1887, and Kalinko, 1887. The Sidama and Wuleda kingdoms were dismantled following brutal campaigns, including the 1894 conquest of Wuleda, after which tens of thousands were killed or enslaved. In the east, Somali pastoral lands, including parts of the Ogaden, were annexed, binding nomadic societies to a sedentary imperial system that neither understood nor accommodated them. Land confiscation followed conquest. Indigenous landholders were dispossessed and replaced by Neftegna, armed settler soldiers drawn largely from the Amhara and Tigrayan highlands. These settlers became landlords, tax collectors, and local administrators. For the conquered populations, incorporation into the Ethiopian state meant not citizenship, but subjugation. Languages were suppressed, cultural practices discouraged, and political authority monopolized by a narrow elite. These imperial structures hardened ethnic and regional inequalities that would persist into the 20th century, embedding resentment deep within the social fabric of the state. Haile Selassie and centralized autocracy, the crown and the peasantry. When Ras Tafari Makoan ascended the throne as Emperor Haile Selassie in 1930, he inherited an empire unified by force but fractured by inequality. Educated, cosmopolitan, and internationally respected, Haile Selassie projected an image of modernity abroad while presiding over rigid autocracy at home. The Ethiopian economy remained overwhelmingly agrarian. Under the feudal land tenure system, approximately 5% of the population, nobles, institutions, and imperial loyalists, controlled over 60% of all arable land. Millions of peasants, particularly in regions such as Gajam, Tigray, Wallo, and Oromia, farmed as tenants. In some areas, peasants surrendered up to half of their harvest in rent and tax. Haile Selassie introduced constitutions in 1931 and 1955, but both preserved absolute imperial authority. Political parties were banned. Parliament existed largely as a ceremonial body. Criticism of the emperor or the monarchy was criminalized, and security services monitored universities, labor unions, and the military. By the 1950s and 1960s, Ethiopia's educated youth, many exposed to Marxist and anti-colonial thought abroad, began to see the emperor not as a symbol of unity, but as the embodiment of stagnation. Structural stressors, when silence became unsustainable. The first public rupture came in December 1960, when officers of the Imperial Guard, led by Brigadier General Mengistu Newe and his brother Jermaine Newe, attempted a coup while Haile Selassie was on a state visit to Brazil. Although the coup failed, its message was unmistakable. Discontent had reached the heart of the state. The emperor responded not with reform, but repression. The most devastating blow, however, came not from guns, but from hunger. Between 1966 and 1973, famine swept through Wallo and Tigray. Conservative estimates placed the death toll between 200,000 and 300,000 people. Entire villages vanished. Children died in their mothers' arms on roadsides. Yet the imperial government suppressed reports, fearing damage to Ethiopia's international image. The truth only emerged after Jonathan Dimbleby's 1973 BBC documentary, The Unknown Famine, exposed the catastrophe to the world. By then, resentment had already hardened into rage. On university campuses in Addis Ababa, students chanted a slogan that cut through centuries of hierarchy: land to the tiller. It was not merely an economic demand. It was an existential challenge to the empire itself. Military officers, junior bureaucrats, teachers, and urban workers echoed the call. The monarchy's sacred aura had dissolved. What remained was a state unable to reform and a society no longer willing to endure. By the early 1970s, Ethiopia was not yet at war, but the foundations of peace had already collapsed. Collapse of the empire and rise of the Derg, 1974. The year the silence broke. Ethiopia in revolt. By the opening months of 1974, the Ethiopian empire was no longer merely strained. It was unraveling. What began as isolated acts of protest quickly converged into a nationwide crisis that exposed the monarchy's brittleness. In January 1974, enlisted men of the 4th Brigade of the Ethiopian Army in Nijili Barana mutinied over unpaid wages, poor living conditions, and rising food costs. Within weeks, similar mutinies erupted among Air Force technicians at Debre Zeit Air Base, naval personnel in Massawa, and police units in Asmara. These were not ideological rebels. They were state servants who could no longer afford bread. At the same time, civilian unrest surged. Teachers in Addis Ababa and provincial towns went on strike, demanding salary adjustments that had been eroded by inflation. University students, radicalized by years of exposure to Marxist literature and enraged by the concealed Wallow famine, flooded the streets chanting against corruption, feudalism, and imperial excess. Fuel prices doubled. Basic food staples disappeared from markets. Long queues formed outside bakeries, where arguments often turned violent. One Addis Ababa taxi driver later recalled parking his vehicle permanently in early 1974 because fuel had become more expensive than a day's earnings. Similar stories echoed across the capital, transforming economic frustration into political fury. By February and March, strikes had paralyzed ports, banks, schools, and transport networks. Emperor Haile Selassie, then in his early 80s, appeared increasingly detached, issuing proclamations while refusing substantive reform. His authority, once unassailable, now seemed ornamental. The birth of the Derg, order from chaos. Amid the spreading disorder, junior military officers began meeting informally, initially to coordinate discipline and stabilize the armed forces. In June 1974, these meetings crystallized into a formal body, the Coordinating Committee of the Armed Forces, Police, and Territorial Army, soon shortened to the Derg. The committee presented itself not as a revolutionary vanguard, but as a corrective mechanism, an internal guardian of national stability. Its early statements emphasized unity, discipline, and loyalty to the emperor. Yet behind closed doors, the Derg rapidly assumed investigative and arrest powers, summoning ministers, generals, and aristocrats for questioning. On September 12, 1974, the illusion of imperial endurance finally collapsed. Emperor Haile Selassie was arrested by military officers and transported quietly from the Jubilee Palace. Photographs later surfaced of the once revered monarch sitting alone in a Volkswagen Beetle, wrapped in a gray blanket, an image that stunned the nation. The monarchy was formally abolished. Ethiopia, ruled by emperors for centuries, ceased to be an empire in a matter of days. Haile Selassie would die in custody on August 27, 1975, under circumstances widely believed, though never officially acknowledged, to involve assassination. Power struggles within the Derg. Revolution turns inward. The Derg's leadership was initially collective, composed of over 100 officers, mostly majors, captains, and lieutenants drawn from across the armed forces. However, unity proved fragile. The first chairman, Lieutenant General Amon Andam, a respected war hero and former defense minister, favored reconciliation. He opposed mass executions and advocated negotiations with Eritrean rebels. His stance quickly isolated him. On the night of November 23, 1974, Amon Andom was killed during a shootout at his residence after refusing arrest. The same night, 60 former imperial officials, including 3 former prime ministers, Attila Habtwold, Indel Kacha and Michael Imru's predecessor, were executed without trial at Elam prison. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. This single act erased any ambiguity about the Derg's direction. Power soon consolidated around Major Mengistu Haile Mariam, a relatively obscure officer from Wallo province, known for his ruthlessness and political cunning. Backed by Major Atnafu Abaid, Mengistu maneuvered systematically, outlasting rivals, manipulating ideological debates, and using fear as a governing tool. Mengistu's ascent was not inevitable, but it was relentless. By exploiting divisions within the Derg and presenting himself as the most uncompromising defender of revolutionary purity, he emerged as the committee's dominant figure by 1976. The revolutionary state, land, blood, and ideology. In March 1975, the Derg announced its most popular and most disruptive policy, the nationalization of all rural land. Land was declared state property. Landlords were stripped of holdings overnight. Peasants were promised equality, but local committees often replaced one form of coercion with another. Banks, insurance companies, factories, and urban rental properties were nationalized. Tens of thousands of urban families lost their livelihoods. Small business owners and shopkeepers in places like Addis Ababa's Mercado district were given days to vacate properties that had supported families for generations. By late 1975, Ethiopia formally declared itself a Marxist-Leninist state, aligning its revolution with global socialist movements. Portraits of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and later Joseph Stalin replaced imperial symbols in public buildings. Revolutionary slogans filled the streets, but beneath them lay prisons filling rapidly with the newly defined enemies of the people. What had begun as a collapse of empire was now transforming into something darker, a revolution that would soon consume its own children. Ethiopia in the Cold War, superpowers, strategy, and sacrifice. A prize on the world map. Why Ethiopia mattered. To Washington and Moscow alike, Ethiopia was not merely a country in turmoil. It was a strategic hinge upon which entire regions could pivot. Before Eritrea's independence, Ethiopia possessed a long and vital coastline along the Red Sea, anchored by the ports of Massawa and Assab. Control of these ports meant influence over one of the world's most critical maritime corridors, the sea lane connecting the Suez Canal to the Indian Ocean, through which Middle Eastern oil flowed toward Europe and North America. Ethiopia also occupied the geographic heart of the Horn of Africa, a narrow geopolitical bottleneck bordered by Sudan, Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, and the Red Sea. From its highlands, surveillance, logistics, and military reach extended across northeast Africa and into the Arabian Peninsula. For global powers, Ethiopia offered something rare: elevation, infrastructure, and political continuity until 1974. This strategic significance was not abstract. In Asmara, the United States operated Cagnu Station, one of its most important overseas intelligence and communications facilities. Staffed by American technicians and guarded by Ethiopian forces, Cagnu Station played a crucial role in intercepting Soviet signals and monitoring missile telemetry during the height of the Cold War. Its presence alone made Ethiopia indispensable to U.S. global strategy. The American alliance, stability over reform. For decades before the revolution, Emperor Haile Selassie had been a reliable American partner. Ethiopia received extensive U.S. military aid, training, and development assistance. Ethiopian officers were educated at U.S. military academies, including Fort Benning and Fort Leavenworth, and American advisors helped modernize the imperial army. Washington viewed Haile Selassie as a stabilizing force in a volatile region, particularly after the rise of nationalist and socialist movements elsewhere in Africa. Concerns about land inequality, repression, and famine were consistently subordinated to strategic calculus. Yet by the early 1970s, cracks in the alliance appeared. The emperor's reluctance to reform, combined with growing instability, made Ethiopia an increasingly risky partner. After the 1974 revolution, U.S. officials hesitated to embrace the Derg, disturbed by its executions and unpredictable internal politics. By 1976, relations had deteriorated sharply. Military aid was curtailed. Human rights concerns mounted. And as Washington distanced itself, Moscow moved decisively to fill the vacuum. The Soviet embrace, ideology meets opportunity. The turning point came in 1977, when Mengistu Haile Mariam, now the dominant figure within the Derg, publicly declared Ethiopia a Marxist-Leninist state and aligned it with the Soviet Union. For Moscow, Ethiopia represented a geopolitical windfall, a populous, centrally located African state with access to the Red Sea and an army already accustomed to centralized command. The Soviet response was swift and massive. By the late 1970s, thousands of Soviet military advisors were embedded within Ethiopian units, from brigade headquarters to intelligence services. The German Democratic Republic, East Germany, trained Ethiopia's security and intelligence apparatus, contributing to the architecture of surveillance and repression later associated with the Red Terror. South Yemen, itself a Marxist state, provided logistical support and regional coordination. Most dramatically, Cuba, under Fidel Castro, deployed over 17,000 combat troops to Ethiopia. Cuban forces, commanded by General Arnaldo Ochoa Sanchez, played a decisive role in halting Somalia's advance during the Ogaden War, 1977 to 1978. Cuban tank units and artillery, supported by Soviet airlift and planning, reversed Ethiopian losses and reshaped the regional balance of power. Arms, advisors, and the human cost. The Soviet-Ethiopian alliance transformed the nature of the Civil War. Ethiopia became one of the largest recipients of Soviet military aid outside the Warsaw Pact. Shipments included T-55 and T-62 tanks, MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighter jets, heavy artillery, rocket launchers, and small arms in vast quantities. For Ethiopian conscripts drafted from rural Amhara villages and sent to fight in Eritrea or Tigray, the Cold War was not an ideological struggle, but a lived nightmare. Foreign weapons, foreign advisors, and wars fought far from home. The influx of weapons emboldened the Derg's belief that military force could solve political problems. Instead, it prolonged the war, intensified counterinsurgency campaigns, and increased civilian casualties. Villages became battlefields. Aid convoys were militarized. Famine relief was subordinated to strategic objectives. By the end of the 1970s, Ethiopia was no longer merely a nation in revolution. It had become a theater of Cold War confrontation, where global rivalries were fought through local blood. Ethiopia's Cold War alignment did not save the revolution, it militarized it. Superpower patronage insulated the Derg from accountability while deepening its dependence on coercion. In the Horn of Africa, ideology did not bring liberation. It imported a global conflict whose costs were paid almost entirely by Ethiopians themselves. The Red Terror, 1977 to 1978, Revolution by Annihilation. Origins, when revolution turned on itself. By 1977, the Ethiopian Revolution had entered its most lethal phase, not against monarchists or foreign enemies, but against fellow revolutionaries. Mengistu Haile Mariam, now the dominant force within the Derg, faced a crisis of legitimacy. While the military regime claimed to rule in the name of socialism, it was increasingly challenged by civilian leftist movements that accused the Derg of betraying the revolution. Foremost among these was the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Party, EPRP, founded in 1972 by radical students and intellectuals. The EPRP rejected military rule outright and called for a people-led socialist government. Its underground cells operated in Addis Ababa, Gondar, Dessie, and Asmara, distributing pamphlets and organizing clandestine resistance. Another key actor was the All-Ethiopia Socialist Movement, MISAN, led by Haile Fida, which initially cooperated with the Derg, believing the military could serve as a transitional force towards socialism. This alliance proved fatal. Once MISAN had helped neutralize civilian opposition to the Derg, its leaders themselves became expendable. Mengistu framed dissent not as political disagreement, but as existential treason. The revolution, he argued, was under attack from anarchists, bandits, and counter-revolutionaries. In this framing, extermination became a form of ideological hygiene. The Declaration, February 3, 1977. On February 3, 1977, in Addis Ababa's Revolution Square, Mengistu made the violence official. Before a crowd of soldiers, militia members, and party cadres, he delivered a speech declaring the launch of the Red Terror, K-Shirber. At its climax, Mengistu raised 3 bottles filled with red liquid, widely reported as symbolizing blood, and smashed them onto the pavement. Death to counter-revolutionaries, he proclaimed. The act was not symbolic theater alone. It was a public authorization to kill. From that moment, violence was no longer hidden or denied. It was policy. Machinery of repression, how the terror worked. The Red Terror was not spontaneous chaos. It was systematic, localized, and bureaucratic, carried out through newly empowered neighborhood committees known as kabiles. Each kabile maintained lists of suspected dissidents, armed youth militias, detention cells, often improvised in schools or administrative buildings. Methods of repression included summary executions. Victims were shot at night or in public spaces without trial. Public display of bodies. Corpses were left on streets for days, often with placards reading "Counter-Revolutionary" tied to the neck. Mass arrests. Thousands were detained in facilities such as Elam became prison, whose name translates to farewell to the world. Torture. Survivors documented beatings, electric shocks, suspension by limbs, and deprivation. Forced denunciations. Parents were coerced into denouncing children. Neighbors were forced to identify neighbors. Children compelled to identify parents. A practice documented by human rights organizations and Ethiopian exile testimonies, particularly in Addis Ababa's Ladida and Piazza districts. One of the most documented survivors, Professor Mesfin Wolde Mariam, a geographer and later human rights activist, was imprisoned during the Red Terror. In later interviews and testimonies, he described the routine sound of executions at night and the public display of bodies near Kabyle offices as instruments of terror. Another witness, Dawit Wolde Georgis, then a senior government official and later minister of relief, recorded in his memoirs how fear hollowed out entire neighborhoods, as educated youth were arrested, killed, or simply disappeared. The targets: youth, students, and the left. The Red Terror disproportionately targeted urban youth, university students, high school pupils, young teachers, junior civil servants. EPRP members were hunted relentlessly. Its leadership was decimated. Tesfaye Debese, one of the party's senior figures, was captured and killed. Underground printing presses were destroyed. Possession of pamphlets became a death sentence. Maizen leaders fared no better. Haile Selassie himself narrowly escaped execution, fleeing into exile after his organization was purged in late 1977. Rank-and-file members were arrested or killed. In Addis Ababa, entire graduating classes vanished. Families were often forced to pay for the bullets used to execute relatives, a documented practice intended to humiliate survivors and fund local militias. Death toll, counting the uncountable. No official accounting of the Red Terror exists. Estimates vary widely. Minimum estimates: 30,000 killed, higher estimates: up to 500,000 deaths. Most historians converge on tens of thousands as a conservative figure, with Addis Ababa as the epicenter. Bodies were buried in mass graves, dumped in ravines, or disappeared entirely. What is beyond dispute is the demographic impact. A generation of politically active, educated Ethiopians was wiped out. Consequences: a society remade by fear. The Red Terror achieved Mengistu's immediate goal, the elimination of independent leftist politics. No civilian socialist movement survived it. The Derg stood alone, ruling through military force and fear. But the deeper cost was societal. Trust between neighbors collapsed. Political participation became synonymous with death. Violence was normalized as governance. Ethiopia emerged from the Red Terror militarized, traumatized, and politically hollowed out. The revolution had devoured its own intellectual and moral core. The Red Terror was not an accident of excess. It was a deliberate strategy. In seeking to monopolize revolution, the Derg extinguished the very ideals it claimed to defend. Long after the gunshots faded, the silence they imposed would shape Ethiopian politics for decades to come. Peripheral wars become central: Eritrea, Tigray, and Oromia. By the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, the Ethiopian Civil War ceased to be centered in Addis Ababa. The decisive struggles shifted to the margins, Eritrea, Tigray, and Oromia, regions long treated as peripheral by imperial and revolutionary governments alike. It was here, far from the capital, that the Derg's authority would be systematically dismantled. Eritrea, the war that preceded the revolution. The Eritrean War of Independence did not begin with the Derg. Its origins lay earlier, in 1961, when Hamid Idris Awad, a former colonial soldier, fired the first shots of armed resistance at Mount Adal, marking the birth of the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF. Eritrea's grievances were distinct. Federated with Ethiopia by a United Nations resolution in 1952, Eritrea had been promised autonomy. That promise was revoked in 1962 when Emperor Haile Selassie unilaterally annexed Eritrea, dissolving its parliament and banning its flag. What followed was not rebellion, but resistance to what Eritreans widely regarded as occupation. By the early 1970s, internal divisions fractured the insurgency. Out of this struggle emerged the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, a disciplined, highly organized movement led by Isaias Afwerki. Unlike the ELF, the EPLF emphasized ideological cohesion, self-reliance, gender equality, and strict military discipline. Fighters, many of them teenagers, underwent political education alongside military training in the harsh terrain of Sahel, northern Eritrea. Fighters later recounted joining the EPLF at 16 after witnessing their village bombed by Ethiopian aircraft. Stories like theirs were not exceptional, they were the norm. The war reached its decisive turning point in March 1988 with the Battle of Alphabet. In a meticulously planned assault, EPLF forces destroyed the Ethiopian Nadu Command, one of the Derg's largest and best-equipped units. Thousands of Ethiopian soldiers were killed or captured. Massive stockpiles of Soviet-supplied weapons fell into rebel hands. Alphabet shattered the myth of Derg invincibility. By 1991, Ethiopian forces had withdrawn entirely. The loss of Eritrea would later leave Ethiopia landlocked, severing its historical access to the Red Sea, a geopolitical consequence that endures to this day. Tigray, from famine to frontline. In the northern highlands of Tigray, war emerged from famine, marginalization, and memory. The region had suffered disproportionately under both imperial neglect and Derg brutality. During the 1973 to 1974 and 1983 to 1985 famines, Tigrayan peasants watched relief supplies diverted or weaponized by the state. In February 1975, a small group of students and activists founded the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. Among them were Meles Zenawi, a former medical student, and Subhat Niga, an experienced organizer. Initially, the TPLF demanded self-determination for Tigray, reflecting deep resentment towards central rule. Armed with little more than rifles and popular support, the TPLF embedded itself in rural communities. Fighters lived among peasants, shared food shortages, and organized local councils. This closeness earned trust and intelligence. Over time, the movement's vision expanded. By the late 1980s, the TPLF no longer sought autonomy alone, but the overthrow of the Derg itself. In 1989, the TPLF spearheaded the creation of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, a coalition designed to challenge the regime nationally. One pivotal moment came with the Battle of Shire, 1989, where TPLF-led forces inflicted a major defeat on Ethiopian government troops, opening western Tigray and severing key supply routes. For many civilians and farmers from Shire, the war meant constant displacement, but also a rare sense of political inclusion, as local assemblies debated governance even amid fighting. Oromia, the largest nation without power. While Eritrea and Tigray fielded structured insurgencies, the struggle in Oromia was broader, more diffuse, and rooted in a longer history of dispossession. The Oromo Liberation Front, OLF, was formed in 1973, articulating grievances that stretched back to Menelik II's 19th-century conquests. Oromo lands had been confiscated. Oromo language, Afan Oromo, was suppressed in schools and administration. Political representation was minimal in a state that relied heavily on Oromo labor and land. The OLF fought both imperial and Derg governments, advocating for self-determination and cultural rights. However, brutal counterinsurgency campaigns, combined with internal fragmentation, limited its military reach compared to the EPLF and TPLF. Nevertheless, the Oromo question remained central. Oromo peasants bore the brunt of forced villagization, conscription, and land seizures. By the late 1980s, it was clear that no Ethiopian government could survive without resolving Oromo exclusion. From margins to the center, what united Eritrea, Tigray, and Oromia was not ideology alone, but experience, conquest, neglect, and coercion. The Derg's reliance on military solutions transformed regional grievances into existential threats to the state. By the end of the 1980s, the EPLF controlled most of Eritrea, the TPLF-led EPRDF dominated northern Ethiopia. Oromo discontent undermined regime authority across the south. The wars once dismissed as peripheral had become decisive. Addis Ababa would fall not to protest, but to armies forged in the margins. The Derg sought unity through force, but Ethiopia's peripheries answered with organization, endurance, and legitimacy rooted in lived suffering. In Eritrea, Tigray, and Oromia, war became not just resistance, but an alternative vision of political order. From these frontiers emerged the forces that would end the Ethiopian Civil War and redefine the nation itself. Major military campaigns and atrocities, 1980s, war against the countryside. By the early 1980s, the Ethiopian Civil War had entered a phase defined not by revolutionary rhetoric, but by systematic violence against civilians. Having failed to defeat insurgent movements through conventional battles, the Derg regime under Mengistu Haile Mariam turned inward, treating Ethiopia's countryside not as territory to govern, but as a hostile population to be controlled, broken, and reordered. Counterinsurgency and scorched earth, re-engineering society by force. Facing resilient guerrilla forces in Eritrea and Tigray, the Derg adopted counterinsurgency strategies that deliberately targeted civilian survival systems. One pillar of this strategy was forced villagization. Beginning in 1985, peasants across northern and southern Ethiopia were compelled to abandon dispersed homesteads and relocate into centralized villages under state surveillance. Officially presented as a development program, villagization allowed security forces to isolate rebel supporters, monitor food production, and control population movement. In practice, it was catastrophic. Entire communities were relocated with little notice. Homes were burned to prevent return. Fields were abandoned mid-season. In Gajam and Wulaga, elders documented cases where villagers who resisted were beaten or shot. Parallel to villagization was mass resettlement. Between 1984 and 1986, the Derg forcibly relocated over 600,000 people, primarily from famine-stricken Tigray and Wallo to sparsely populated regions in the southwest, including Ilyabeber and Kaffa. The program was overseen by senior Derg officials and enforced by the military. One of the most cited testimonies comes from Dawit Wolde Georges, then Ethiopia's Commissioner for Relief and Rehabilitation, who later defected. He documented how transport trucks were loaded with starving families, many of whom died en route from disease, exhaustion, or exposure. Survivors arrived in malaria-infested lowlands without shelter, tools, or medical care. Food itself became a weapon. Grain markets were restricted. Aid was withheld from rebel-held areas. Crops were burned, livestock slaughtered, and water sources contaminated in counterinsurgency zones, particularly in Tigray's rural districts. The objective was clear: starve the insurgency by starving the people. The 1983 to 1985 famine, catastrophe by design. The famine that devastated Ethiopia between 1983 and 1985 was not caused solely by drought. It was magnified and prolonged by war, policy, and repression. By conservative estimates, up to 1 million people died. Regions under heavy military operations, Tigray, Wallo, and northern Shua, were hit hardest. Roads were closed. Relief convoys were blocked. International agencies were denied access unless they cooperated with government resettlement plans. Journalist Jonathan Dimbleby, whose earlier work had exposed famine under Haile Selassie, returned to document the new catastrophe. His reporting revealed that aid shipments were being diverted or delayed for military reasons. Some relief was conditioned on compliance with relocation orders. Globally, The famine triggered unprecedented humanitarian response. Live Aid, 1985, raised millions, but much of the aid flowed through state channels controlled by the Derg. Scholars and aid workers later concluded that this system allowed the regime to leverage international compassion to sustain its war effort. Decisive battles, the military tide turns. Despite massive Soviet military support, the Derg began to lose control of the battlefield by the late 1980s. The first decisive rupture occurred in March 1988 at the Battle of Alphabet in Eritrea. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, launched a coordinated assault on the Ethiopian Nadu Command, one of the largest formations in the Derg's army. In a matter of days, the command was annihilated. Thousands of government troops were killed or captured, and vast quantities of weapons were seized. Alphabet marked the beginning of irreversible military decline. In 1989, the focus shifted to northern Ethiopia. At the Battle of Shire, forces led by the TPLF, now operating under the EPRDF coalition, defeated key government units and severed supply lines to Eritrea. The loss of Shire effectively collapsed Derg control over much of Tigray and western Gondar. For soldiers conscripted from Gajam captured at Shire, the defeat symbolized more than a lost battle. It revealed a state exhausting its youth for a war it could no longer win. By the end of the decade, northern Ethiopia had slipped from government hands. The army was demoralized, overstretched, and increasingly isolated as Soviet support dwindled following reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev. The human reckoning. These campaigns left scars that outlived the war. Entire regions depopulated, agricultural systems shattered, generations displaced or lost. What distinguished the 1980s was not only the scale of violence, but its logic. War was waged not just against insurgents, but against livelihoods, memory, and continuity. In the 1980s, Ethiopia's war reached its most destructive form. The Derg attempted to defeat rebellion by unmaking society itself, through famine, displacement, and terror. Instead, it accelerated its own collapse. The countryside it sought to dominate became the ground from which its defeat emerged. Collapse of the Derg and the end of the war, 1991, the long march to Addis Ababa. By the dawn of 1991, the Ethiopian state created by the Derg was no longer held together by ideology or legitimacy, but by inertia. The army was exhausted, Soviet support had evaporated, and vast territories in the north were under insurgent control. What remained was a regime increasingly isolated, politically, militarily, and morally. The formation of the EPRDF, from regional rebellion to national alternative. The decisive force that emerged from this collapse was the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF. Formed in 1989, the EPRDF was not a spontaneous alliance, but the culmination of years of coordination led by the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF. Under the strategic leadership of Meles Zenawi, alongside senior figures such as Subhat Nega, the TPLF broadened its struggle beyond Tigray. It incorporated allied movements. The Amhara National Democratic Movement, ANDM, representing sections of the Amhara peasantry disillusioned with the Derg, the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, OPDO, created from Oromo fighters and defectors from the Derg's own forces, smaller allied groups representing southern nationalities. This coalition allowed the EPRDF to present itself not as a separatist force, but as a national alternative to military dictatorship. Its fighters advanced with discipline, often avoiding the scorched earth tactics that had alienated the population under the Derg. The fall of Addis Ababa, a regime unravels. As EPRDF forces advanced southward in early 1991, resistance collapsed with surprising speed. Entire Derg units surrendered or defected. Supply lines disintegrated. Soldiers abandoned heavy weapons and returned to villages from which they had been conscripted. On May 21, 1991, Mengistu Haile Mariam fled Ethiopia. In the early hours of the morning, he boarded a plane bound for Harare, Zimbabwe, where President Robert Mugabe granted him asylum. His departure was neither announced nor ceremonially marked. It was a quiet exit from a country he had ruled through terror for nearly 2 decades. Mengistu left behind tens of thousands of prisoners, abandoned military stockpiles, and a shattered bureaucracy. For families who had lost loved ones during the Red Terror, his flight felt less like closure than escape from accountability. Just days later, on May 28, 1991, EPRDF forces entered Addis Ababa. There was no decisive urban battle. The capital, once the epicenter of revolutionary violence, fell with eerie calm. Residents emerged cautiously, uncertain whether this was liberation or another prelude to repression. For the first time in years, there were no gunshots. Eritrea, independence sealed. While Ethiopia's internal war ended in 1991, the fate of Eritrea was already sealed by the battlefield. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, under Isaias Afwerki, had achieved full military control by May 1991, coordinating its final offensives with the EPRDF. Eritrea's de facto independence was recognized by the new Ethiopian leadership almost immediately. In April 1993, a United Nations supervised referendum was held. Over 99% of Eritrean voters chose independence. The result was internationally recognized, formally ending a 30-year war. For Ethiopia, the consequence was historic and irreversible. The country became landlocked, losing direct access to the Red Sea for the first time in centuries. Ports such as Assab and Massawa, once central to Ethiopian trade and military planning, were now sovereign Eritrean territory. For Eritreans who had grown up in EPLF-run refugee camps, the vote represented the culmination of a lifetime of sacrifice. For Ethiopians, it marked both relief and loss. The war ends, the questions remain. By 1991, the Ethiopian Civil War, one of Africa's longest and deadliest, had ended. Yet its resolution left profound questions unanswered. How to reckon with mass violence and famine? How to rebuild a society militarized for decades? How to govern a country restructured along ethnic lines? The fall of the Derg closed one chapter of Ethiopian history, but it opened another, shaped by the very forces that had defeated it. The collapse of the Derg was not a sudden overthrow, but a slow disintegration, eroded by resistance from the margins and sustained by the endurance of those who survived famine, terror, and war. In May 1991, Addis Ababa did not celebrate loudly, it exhaled. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but exhaustion and the uncertain hope that the worst had finally passed. Human cost and legacy, what the war left behind. When the guns fell silent in 1991, Ethiopia did not emerge into peace so much as into aftermath. The civil war had ended, but its human and moral costs were etched into bodies, families, and institutions in ways that no ceasefire could undo. Casualties, counting loss in a land without graves. Between 1974 and 1991, Ethiopia lost an estimated 1.4 to 2 million people to war, famine, execution, and displacement. These figures, drawn from demographic studies, humanitarian agencies, and post-war investigations, are necessarily imprecise because much of the killing occurred beyond record, trial, or burial. In Addis Ababa, victims of the Red Terror were dumped on streets or buried in unmarked pits. In Tigray and Wallo, famine claimed lives quietly, one household at a time. In Eritrea, entire cohorts of young men and women died on front lines that shifted for decades. For families and civil servants whose sons disappeared in 1978 after being taken by Kabyle militia in Addis Ababa, there was no death certificate, no funeral, and no official acknowledgement, only absence. Thousands of families shared similar fates, trapped in what scholars later called ambiguous loss. Displacement compounded death. Millions were uprooted, some forcibly resettled by the Derg, others fleeing active combat zones. Refugee camps in Sudan, Djibouti, Somalia, and Kenya became long-term homes for Ethiopians who never returned. Entire childhoods were spent in exile. The psychological toll was equally profound. Survivors of detention centers such as Elam became carried trauma that would never be clinically treated. Children raised amid fear learned silence as survival. Violence became normalized, not as ideology, but as memory. Political legacy, a state rebuilt on identity. In the war's aftermath, Ethiopia did not restore the centralized state that had collapsed. Instead, the EPRDF government, led by Meles Zenawi, embarked on a radical restructuring of the country's political architecture. In 1995, Ethiopia adopted a new constitution introducing ethnic federalism, a system that reorganized the state into regions largely defined by language and ethnicity. For the first time, Ethiopia formally acknowledged the rights of its nations, nationalities, and peoples, including the theoretical right to self-determination. This framework addressed long-standing grievances rooted in imperial conquest and cultural suppression. Oromo language education expanded. Regional administrations gained autonomy. Marginalized identities received constitutional recognition. Yet the same system institutionalized ethnicity as the primary axis of political life. Power, resources, and representation became tied to identity categories hardened by law. Political competition increasingly followed ethnic lines, reviving tensions that the Civil War had never fully resolved. For observers such as Professor Merera Gadina, an Oromo political scientist, ethnic federalism represented both liberation and risk, correcting historic injustices while embedding identity into governance in ways that could fracture national cohesion. Moral reckoning, justice deferred. The question of accountability lingered long after victory. In 2006, Ethiopian courts convicted Mengistu Haile Mariam in absentia for genocide and crimes against humanity related to the Red Terror. In 2008, he was sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment. Mengistu remained in Zimbabwe, protected by political asylum granted decades earlier. While the verdict held symbolic weight, its impact was limited. Mengistu never stood before victims. No public confession occurred. No shared national narrative of wrongdoing emerged. Beyond Mengistu, accountability was uneven. Thousands of former Derg officials were detained in the 1990s, many for years without trial. Others reintegrated quietly into society. The state prioritized stability over collective reckoning. Crucially, Ethiopia never undertook a comprehensive truth and reconciliation process. There was no equivalent of South Africa's TRC, no public forum for victims to testify, perpetrators to confess, or society to collectively confront its past. For survivors whose family members were executed in 1977 for alleged EPRP affiliation, justice felt incomplete. The regime had fallen, but the truth remained fragmented, spoken in whispers rather than acknowledged in law. A legacy still unfinished. The Ethiopian Civil War reshaped the nation's demography, politics, and moral landscape. It ended imperial rule, destroyed revolutionary illusions, and redrew the map of the state. But it did not resolve the core questions it unleashed: who belongs, who governs, and how violence should be remembered. The war's legacy lives on not only in institutions, but in silences, between generations, across communities, and within a country still negotiating the meaning of unity after survival. History records battles and treaties, but societies carry memories. Ethiopia emerged from its civil war alive but altered, burdened by loss without full acknowledgement. Until that reckoning is shared, until truth is spoken alongside power, the past remains present, shaping the future from beneath the surface. When revolution consumed the nation, the Ethiopian Civil War was never a single war. It was a collision of unfinished histories. Imperial conquest layered over Cold War rivalry, revolutionary idealism hardened into absolutism, and a multinational society forced to answer the question of belonging through violence. The roots stretched back beyond 1974, beyond the fall of Haile Selassie, into the very formation of the Ethiopian state. Successive regimes had ruled by centralization, coercion, and cultural hierarchy. When the imperial order collapsed, it did not leave behind a vacuum. It released decades of suppressed grievances into a political space dominated by ideology rather than reconciliation. What followed under the Derg, and particularly under Mengistu Haile Mariam, was not merely repression but a theory of governance through terror. The Red Terror, 1977 to 1978, marked the point at which the revolution turned inward. In the streets of Addis Ababa, bodies were left uncollected as warnings. Mothers were denied the right to mourn. Silence became a survival skill. This violence was not random. It was bureaucratized, ritualized, and ideologically justified. Local Kabyle officials, many barely older than their victims, were empowered to decide who lived and who disappeared. The state did not merely kill opponents. It trained society to participate in fear. Yet terror was only one face of the war. In the countryside, entire regions were treated as enemy populations. In Tigray and Wallo, famine was allowed to unfold amid active counterinsurgency. Forced resettlement programs uprooted peasants who had survived drought only to perish along transport routes or in unfamiliar lands. Cold War geopolitics sustained the machinery. The Soviet Union, Cuba, and Allied states armed the Derg not because it protected Ethiopians, but because Ethiopia mattered strategically. Ideology, not accountability, determined loyalty. As long as the regime remained aligned, human cost was secondary. When the Derg finally collapsed in 1991, it did so militarily, not morally. Mengistu fled, the system dissolved, and a new political order emerged, but no national confession followed. Ethiopia never collectively asked, who authorized the killings? Who benefited from silence? Who was never mourned? The post-war state sought unity through constitutional redesign rather than historical reckoning. Ethnic federalism attempted to resolve past injustices structurally, but it did not heal psychological wounds. The memory of terror, who killed whom and why, remained fragmented along ethnic, regional, and generational lines. For survivors, the fall of the Derg did not bring closure. Justice arrived as a court verdict delivered decades later against a man living comfortably in exile, without apology or acknowledgement. The Ethiopian Civil War thus leaves behind a sobering lesson. Ideals divorced from humanity become instruments of annihilation. Equality enforced through terror becomes tyranny. Unity imposed by force fractures the very nation it claims to save. Ethiopia's modern struggles, political polarization, identity conflict, cycles of insurgency, cannot be understood without confronting this era honestly. Not as propaganda, not as partisan memory, but as a shared tragedy. Because a nation that does not fully remember how life became expendable will always risk repeating the moment when ideology became more sacred than the people it claimed to liberate. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share.